Good morning. I'm going to try and talk for the allotted time of 30 minutes. My problem is I like telling stories, and hence I can ramble. So what I'm hoping is that there will be some stories and there will be some rambling, but that there is a sort of a coherent set of ideas about the current state of Argentine politics, which is helpful to you all. So bear with me if I go off in different directions. So let me start with two stories, very, very quick ones. I was partly brought up in Argentina, lived in Buenos Aires, and was out there again as a correspondent in the early 1980s. And that time, 70s and 80s, that's whatever it is, 40, 50 years ago now, I noticed two things, two little anecdotes, which I'd like to mention, and which I think have a bearing on what comes later. Interviewing various people, trying to understand a very kind of chaotic Argentine political situation, I always remember one interviewee who literally insisted that nothing in Argentina was decided or thought of on a time term of more than 7 days. And his argument at the time was that most people, because of rampant inflation and exchange rate uncertainty, most people put their money on 7-day term deposits. So they were always interested in what's going to happen over the next 7 days. You know, next week, next month, next year. Who knows? Who can bother about that? So, point one, there was and has been a lot of short-termism in Argentine politics and society. My argument is that it's less, but it is still a problem. The other little story is that in Argentina everyone is obsessed with the exchange rate. The exchange rate is never right. The Argentine Austral or peso, whatever the currency is called, it seems, this is completely anecdotal, is either massively undervalued or massively overvalued. And there have been periods in Argentina when very high domestic interest rates, because of inflation, have attracted massive speculative inflows, and you have a period of very, very strong currency, which is followed by a period of rapid, sometimes chaotic depreciation. And there's a name for this in Argentina, and there have even been films made about it, and it's called plata dulce, sweet money. So any Argentine can remember periods when there was sweet money, and in one of those periods I was in Argentina, and one of the effects was that people would fly to Miami to buy things, stick them on the plane and fly back to Buenos Aires. Argentines were known as deme dos, give me two. And that story came from the fact that allegedly, it's probably made up, but allegedly Argentines would walk into sort of hi-fi and electricity stores in Miami and say, how much is that television? Yeah, it's $300. Deme dos, give me two of them. And they'd be taken back. So those are the two sort of things that I will come back to. What am I going to try and do in this presentation? Tell you that stop-go is the big problem in Argentina, both in economics and in politics, what I describe as political short-termism. We're looking at an election where the main battle is between Mauricio Macri and Alberto Fernandez, or really Cristina Fernandez. They're not related, but I will explain a bit of that, some of the background, the role that corruption plays, which is still very significant in Argentine politics, and the fact that both, for all sorts of reasons, the two main candidates are moving towards the centre. I'll try and explain the dynamics of that, and a few ideas of what might happen in future. Now, this is the key slide of my entire presentation. So I'll spend a little bit of time trying to explain it. And I think the best way to approach it is, let us assume, this is a simplification, but but let us assume that the Argentine voter is primarily interested in economic matters. I know this isn't, there are a lot of other issues, but let's assume that, the Bill Clinton thing, it's the economy, stupid. If that is the case, if all Argentine voters want a period of strong economic growth, they will look at the different candidates in terms of their record so far, and if not individual candidates, certainly the political movements that those candidates come from. So if we look over the last 15 years, who did better? Very, very crude question. And the answer is, or appears to be, that Nestor Kirchner did best in about that period from 2005 to 2007. GDP growth was in some cases above 10%. It was good. You just look at those bars there. There was more economic growth. It's true that that was itself a result of a major recession in 2001, 2002. Argentina had defaults, devaluation, complete sort of implosion of the economic system. Nestor, in the popular imagination, was the guy who fixed it. So he did very well. If you then look at the blue bit, his successor, his wife Cristina, she had a more mixed performance. There was some years of recession connected to the 2008-2009 global recession, but her own economic policies, which were nationalist, populist, based on really don't tax very much and spend a lot, might be a summary for it. It was deficit, and she did quite badly overall. And if you look at Mauricio Macri's administration, he comes in 2005, he's done pretty badly as well. The first year, the country was in recession. That might be explainable because a new government had to try and correct some of the imbalances in the economy that Cristina had left in. He had a little spurt of growth in 2017, and from about April 2018 onwards, it's been crisis again. There's been repeated waves of depreciation of the peso. Argentina had to sign a $56 billion standby agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and the economy has been struggling. So the other thing I'd like to point out is that, hence the title of the slide, nothing seems to last more than 2 years. It is a stop-go economy. Now, my argument is that there are aspects of the political system which mesh with that economic stop-go cycle and prevent a longer-term approach to things. And the main issue is there are general elections every 4 years, and there are midterm elections in the in-between. So every 2-year period you have major elections. And politicians focus on trying to win those elections. So it's not quite, I only care about the next 7 days. The current situation, which arguably is an improvement, is I only care about the next 2 years. If I'm in government, I have to win the next set of elections. And I would argue that that is still too much of a short term. Now, the next thing I'd like to try and explain, simplifying terribly, is that Argentina politically is what I'd call a game of 3/3. So there are 3 major political blocs in Argentina today. One of those blocs is Peronist. Bloc number 2 is also Peronist. And bloc number 3 is more of a classic centre-right political party. What do I mean by 2 blocs being Peronist? Well, the history of the last few years is that you have a kind of hardcore Peronism, which in its latest incarnation is sort of left-of-centre, populist nationalist. And that is represented by largely by Cristina Fernández, who followed on from her husband, Néstor. There is, apart from that hardcore Peronism, there's what you might call moderate Peronism, for want of a better word. And that is a sort of more traditional left-of-centre, slightly left-of-centre perhaps, type movement, which, to put it crudely, believes in redistribution, but also believes in working with the market. And that's, I won't go into a long history of Peronism, because basically Peronism has all sorts of different, it ranges from right to left, has all sorts of different people in it. But for the purposes of this talk, there's Kirchnerismo, which is the more nationalist populist version of Peronism, and there is more moderate Peronism. And then the third block is Mauricio Macri's Cambiemos coalition, which itself has got various different political parties in it, but you can describe as a sort of pro-market, pro-rule of law type movement. And each of those thirds have sort of, the support for them has varied, but roughly a third of the electorate has aligned with each of them. There is a hard core of Kirchneristas, people who will support Cristina do or die, and they are somewhere leading up to 30% of the electorate. There's a hard core of Macristas, people who support Mauricio Macri, and they are, somewhere maybe 20 to 30%, and then there's a middle ground. Now, the battle, therefore, for the elections this year has been which of the 3/3 can make an alliance and politically become a force representing 2/3 or appealing to 2/3 of the electorate. It's one of those love triangles, for want of a better word, where of three main players, which two are going to get together and defeat the other one. And the interesting thing is, what we have seen is an attempt by the Kirchneristas on one hand and Mauricio Macri on the other to grab the middle ground, which is this ground of more moderate Peronists. Now, Cristina surprised everyone in May. It was truly, truly unexpected. She was leading in the opinion polls, partly because of Macri's financial and economic difficulties, falling living standards. She was doing very well, and the opinion polls suggested she was leading the race. Then, on a Saturday morning, with no warning whatsoever, she announced that the candidate for president was not going to be her, but it was going to be Alberto Fernández. And she was going to be candidate for vice president. So, it's quite so bizarre. Usually, you elect the candidate, and the candidate chooses who will be his or her vice president, their running mate. Here was the running mate, who many think holds the real power, saying, Blogs is going to be president, and I'm going to be vice president. And many Argentines think, and I'm going to run the show. So many think she will be the power behind Alberto Fernández. 2 quick points. Who is Alberto Fernández? He's a Peronist, but he's a guy who represents the Néstor Kirchner years, those years of strong economic growth. He actually parted ways with Cristina and had some quite significant differences over the way she taxed agricultural exports and a whole number of issues. So he represents that middle third of moderate Peronists. It's also true that you need to try and explain, why did she do this? What was the point? One interpretation is to do with corruption. So because the economy is terribly bad at the moment, Cristina's got an advantage. But her major disadvantage is that her government, beyond doubt, was very corrupt. She now has, it's about 4 or 5 separate corruption cases which are very slowly working their way through the Argentine legal system. Because she's a senator, she has immunity from prosecution, but it's conditional immunity. So what happens is the investigations go ahead, the judiciary can request that the Senate lift her immunity, which has happened in various cases, and the Senate has so far defended her. So from her point of view, even though she was leading in the opinion polls, the whole issue of corruption is a major political liability. So some believe that by appointing Alberto as her presidential, top of the presidential ticket, she's shifting the debate away from her own record on issues like corruption, and perhaps even more importantly, she's ensuring that she keeps out of jail, because as vice president, if she wins, she will also have continuing immunity from prosecution. So it would appear quite a smart maneuver. However, the key question for many voters, this is known as the Fernandez ticket, and the question is, who's really in power and how will decisions be taken? Do we get a new, more moderate economic policy, or is it a return to the old big deficits and sort of kind of populist and running of the economy? Apart from other things, Cristina renationalized some industries, and therefore presided over a period in which there was very low foreign investment and high political risk. The last thing I should say about that is that there was a period in the early 1970s when, after a whole succession of military regimes, free elections were held, but the military said the elections will be free up to a point. We are going to prevent General Perón, who was the original founder of the Peronist movement, we're going to prevent him from standing. So the Peronists instead chose a candidate called Héctor Cámpora, and the slogan was Cámpora to the presidency, Perón to power. And sure enough, Cámpora was elected, and the first thing he did was call new elections at which Perón was allowed to stand, and Perón did win it in the 70s. So playing on that, Argentines are now saying Fernandez to the presidency, Fernandez to power, but which Fernandez are we talking about? On the other hand, you have the centre-right of the political spectrum, led by President Mauricio Macri, who's seeking re-election. Now, he too, in response to this manoeuvre, he too has moved to the moderate Peronists by getting Miguel Ángel Pichetto to stand as his vice president. Pichetto is a senator for Rio Negro province, a very influential and moderate politician. In a sense, it's trying to do the same thing as Cristina's trying to do. Another way of explaining it is that of the middle third of Argentine politics is being pulled apart by the other two thirds, by the Cristina third and the Macri third. Now, Macri's got difficulties. He's still in contention, but his record is not that good. And the real driving thing is that the economy is bad, there is a recession, and living standards have fallen quite strongly. You can argue this from lots of points of view. In some ways, you can say there's been progress. The crisis of 2001-2002 led to an almost total collapse in Argentina. The democratically elected president at the time had to be taken out of government house by helicopter because literally the crowds were attacking the seat of government. You had a succession of short presidents. You had default. People could not take their money out of their bank accounts. The banks closed down. It was absolutely chaotic. Now, you could say that the situation in 2018, 2019 is also chaotic, but institutions have shown themselves to be stronger. You don't have an elected president, Macri, resigning or being forced out. He hangs on in there and will take the electoral consequences. So in some ways there is a story that Argentina's institutions are strengthening. However, it could also be argued that it would have been better for the Cambiemos, now called Juntos por el Cambio coalition, to have come up with a fresh face. Some say the fresh face would be Maria Eugenia Vidal, who's the current governor of Buenos Aires province, who, if you like, is an up-and-coming politician, but she's gone for re-election in what's going to be a very difficult gubernatorial race in the most populous constituency in Argentina. They are really the main contenders. There is a third person in the race, who's Roberto Lavagna, and it's interesting because he was a former economy minister, and he too is associated with the Nestor Kirchner years when the economy grew quite strongly. He's widely seen as a capable, pragmatic figure who has a reputation for getting Argentina out of economic trouble. So that is his appeal. With Governor Juan Manuel Urtubey of Salta province, who has also got a kind of pro-market, Peronist type reputation. This, if you like, is all that's left of the centre third of the moderate Peronist offer, and it's not doing too well in the opinion polls. So this is how it looks at the moment. Essentially, the blue line up at the top is the Fernandez ticket. The one beneath it is the Macri-Pichetto ticket. And then down below are the others, of which perhaps it's only worth mentioning the green line, which is Lavagna. So what has happened here is the 3/3 are in the process of breaking down into two main options. The middle third is kind of really down to sort of somewhere under 10% of the support. And as you can see, the opinion polls are saying the race is wide open. Fernandez has been leading, but the gap, Macri has begun to close the gap. The economy is beginning to improve. Inflation is beginning to come down. There are some positive indicators, but we're very, very close to the elections, so it's not quite sure who's going to win it. I should explain a little bit quickly about the electoral mechanism. There will be primaries in whatever it is, 2 weeks' time, on the 11th of August. The primaries are called PASO, obligatory, simultaneous and open primaries. Bizarrely, the way the political parties have aligned themselves, these are not going to be primaries because most parties do not have an internal contest, or most coalitions. So all the primaries are going to be is like a measure of strength ahead of the general elections on the 27th of October. What they're looking for, what Macri is looking for, is to get most votes in the primaries, to build a sense of momentum as he goes forwards to October, and that is exactly the same that Cristina Fernandez is looking for. Under the the Argentine electoral system, to win the presidency, you need to either have 45% or more of the popular vote, or you need to have 40% and be 10 percentage points ahead of your nearest rival. If you don't achieve either of those two things, there is a second round runoff ballot. Everyone expects, as things are at the moment, that there will be a second round runoff ballot between Fernandez and Macri-Pichetto. So the general elections are on the 27th of October. The second round runoff is on the 24th of November, and the new government will take office. It's usually on the 15th of mid-December, 15th of December. I've kind of gulped and said they probably want me to make a prediction. So here's my prediction. It could be disastrously wrong, but I think there's a 55% probability that Macri-Pichetto will win and be re-elected. If that's the case, there are still lots of questions to answer. So he's unlikely to have a clear majority in Congress. His coalition doesn't have a majority in Congress at present and has had to govern by doing deals on particular bits of legislation. Under the existing IMF program, we can expect that GDP will finally turn positive again next year, probably not by very much, and will then begin growing. There will be slippage on the IMF program. There's already been slippage. So and partly because he's trying to win the elections. So in the latest, I think it's the fourth revision of the IMF program, the primary government balance has gone from a small surplus. They're now targeting a small deficit. Macri has made concessions. He had a program to boost tariff rates, electricity, water, gas. He's actually frozen those in an attempt to help him win the elections. If Macri is the winner, I think one of the important political consequences will be that we will be looking at the possible, not the end of Kirchnerismo, but certainly a period in which it is more likely to break up and new movements, new leaders will emerge from Peronism. I think a Macri victory, most investors would say a Macri victory means that economic reforms will be resumed. But in this scenario, there will still be difficulties getting them through Congress. So the reform process might be quite piecemeal. I'm assigning a 45% probability to a Fernandez victory. My own reading, and I may be completely wrong, is that this kind of arrangement with Alberto running for the presidency and Cristina for the vice presidency will trouble a significant proportion of the Argentine electorate, and they'll think, who's really running the show here? And that may cause them not to vote or to vote for Macri instead. So in the Fernandez victory scenario, there are two sub-scenarios, one of which is actually Alberto is running it. He's a moderate Peronist politician, and he will really seize the reins of power. Now, he's already saying this in his election campaigning. He's saying, it's my opinions that count. And interestingly, Cristina is, she's kind of on the campaign trail, but she's not appearing that much with him. He's doing his own thing. So the sub-scenario one is Alberto runs things. There's still a little bit of worry about Cristina's actual role. Another scenario is Cristina really controls power. And that would send out quite an unsettling message to investors and to the markets. The IMF program, Alberto's wording is the IMF program would be reworked, renegotiated in some way. If Cristina is really running the show, that's much more likely. Sorry, that's telling me that 30 minutes are up, so I'll wind up. There will be, I should also say that the IMF programs in Argentina have a terrible history. I can't give you the exact number, but in the post-war period, there've probably been somewhere between 15 and 20 IMF standby agreements, and most of them have ended up badly. They've been, they haven't gone the full term. Also, there's less likely to be an economic reform process. So, very quickly, I'll rush you through this. Why should we be pessimistic about Argentina? One reason is that everything is still based on 2 years and you need longer term planning. Also, because the balance of forces in Congress is quite fragmented, there are lots of people, different parties, there is more of a tendency to go for pork barrel politics. You vote for my bill, I'll make sure your provincial budget increases, a kind of wheeling dealing thing, which we've seen in neighbouring Brazil, has led to quite catastrophic corruption, where in Brazil presidents have multi-party coalitions and they need to buy off and sort of look after all the members of the coalition. Some of that is done purely by legal means. I'll give you a ministry, I'll give you this, and some of it is done by essentially corruption. You'll get 2% of this contract and so on. So that is that's an issue. Pessimism, debt servicing. One of the major criticisms of the Macri government is that it has borrowed massively. In the latest IMF review of the Argentine economy, deep down in some table, I found a memo item, total external debt as a percentage of GDP. In 2015, when Macri took office, it was 27.9% of GDP. In 2019, according to the IMF, it's 59.8%. So total foreign debt has more than doubled in the 4 years of Macri's time in office. So it's back to, I think that is back to La Plata Dulce, sweet money. It all flowed in, massive amounts of money. Where's it actually gone? How has it not led to what you'd hope to see, increases in productivity? And I think that's partly to do with the way the political system works. Other reasons for pessimism: the economy is fragile, future external shocks may shake it further. Argentina also has a tradition of very militant labor unions. Because of falling living standards, you could have a period of significant labor unrest, and the tradition of populism doesn't help when you're trying to reform the economy. There are reasons for optimism. Argentina has got massive natural resources. It is already a major force on the international agricultural exports market, particularly for soya. Interestingly, if you look at the Andes, Chile on the western side, Argentina on the eastern side, Chile on the western slopes of the Andes, Chile has a massive mining industry, copper, zinc, lithium, and I can't remember straight off my head, but I think mining represents maybe 10-15% of Chilean GDP. On the eastern slopes of the Andes in Argentine territory, mining has really been neglected for decades. It probably represents 2 or 3% of GDP. So it seems reasonable to assume that you don't get absolutely all the mineral deposits only on one side of the Andes, but there are significant deposits on the Argentine side that have yet to be exploited. Vaca Muerta is one of the biggest shale oil and gas reserves in the world, and it is beginning to be developed. That will be developed whoever's in power, but you can argue that the Macri Pichetto government is more likely to support investment and to give the political and legal stability that's needed for that for those deposits to be fully exploited. After 20 years of negotiations, Mercosur, the trading bloc, which is Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay and Paraguay, has finally signed a free trade agreement with the European Union, and that does present significant opportunities for Argentina. There are, it may sound a bit optimistic to say it, but you know, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, the move to digital production systems. Argentina has quite high education standards and a long tradition in IT and engineering, and already has some companies which are quoted on the New York Stock Exchange, and have shown that they can be world-class competitors. So there are lots of reasons for optimism. I suppose the main idea I want to leave you with is that you need a political movement that is able to look forward on more than a 2-year time horizon to begin to make the next Argentine boom more sustainable. I think there will be an Argentine boom. The danger is that it lasts less than 2 years and we're still back to the stop, go. That's where I've got to. I've run over a bit, so apologies.
Thank you very much. Just see if this works. Yes, cool. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. I think I pretty much agreed with everything you said, so I'll try and throw some things in there that are a bit different. Thank you to Menes for inviting me here to speak, and thank you for Beasley for hosting us. My name's Stuart Culverhouse. I'm the Chief Economist and Head of Fixed Income Research at Telema. We are a investment banking platform that focuses on frontier and developing markets, formerly known as exotics. I've got some colleagues in the room. If you want to know a bit more, then please do. But in the interest of time, I'm going to try and whiz through my presentation. My presentation is mainly focused on the economics. Obviously, you can't necessarily separate economics and politics in Argentina, as we've just heard, but I don't necessarily want to repeat what Andrew has said. There may be some overlap, but more at the end of my presentation, I'll be talking about different policy-making options and outturns, which I think will be a crucial area to go forward. I've got about 8 slides, 15 minutes, give or take. So let's get going. My perspective is really from the financial markets. So it's not from a direct investor perspective, not really FDI, it's not a corporate investing in various sectors in the country, but it's on the financial markets, so bond and currency focus. But hopefully that is going to be relevant to you. I should also say it's difficult to know where to pitch a presentation like this, given mix of backgrounds and maybe what people know or don't know. So hopefully there's something here for everyone. I'm going to start with this first slide, which I think encapsulates pretty much the Argentina situation as you need to know it. It's a graph which shows perceptions of country risk given by bond spreads for Argentina and by comparison purposes for an emerging market basket as well. If you're not familiar with financial markets and emerging market bonds, I won't go into the detail, but I think the key here is just to look at where the lines are, where they are trending, and the difference between them. So you can see in the first part of this graph a convergence between Argentina, the top red line, and the emerging market universe, the bottom orange line, a convergence in expectations of country risks. The graph starts at the beginning of 2016, which is essentially after Macri arrived, after the 2015 election. And Argentina, it had a lot of things to deal with. Macri had to undo a lot of the imbalances that had been built up under Kirchnerism over best part of 13 years. But Argentina began to look a little bit more like a normal emerging market, dare I say it. You saw this convergence in the country risk perception with the highlighted box in the middle, the 100-year bond issue, which we heard about earlier, which saw strong demand and looked as though Argentina was now in a very rosy situation. Spreads continued to narrow, so it was converging towards emerging markets as a whole. So a good place for Macri. That was at the end of 2017, also fresh out of midterm elections, the 2-year cycle, in which he did reasonably well as well to consolidate his position. But there are 3 stages in this graph. That's the first stage, sort of the normalisation of Argentina. The second half, you see this divergence in Argentina country risk perceptions. So Argentinian bond spreads have rocketed up. As you can see, they're touching 1,000 basis points at some stage, whereas emerging markets have wobbled a little bit for various reasons, but have generally been at this much lower stable level. So you see this divergence. I say this 2-stage widening began in the spring of last year. So firstly, you had a reappraisal of the global interest rate cycle, the US Treasuries, etc., and that caused risk aversion in markets, and people reduced their emerging market exposure. Argentina sold off with other countries. But Argentina and Turkey probably got hit the most because they were seen as the most exposed to a turn in the global interest rate cycle because, as you've heard, they're very high financing requirements, they're large current account deficits, and therefore with higher interest rates could they finance it. So you saw this partly externally driven widening in Argentina's country risk measures. There are also some domestic policy inadequacies in terms of perceived gradualism of the Macri adjustment, some monetary policy mistakes, let's say, and still fairly lax fiscal policy. So it's a combination of both, but the result was Argentina's country risk widened and ultimately forced a request to the fund for a program. $56 billion after a revision, so the biggest in dollar terms of any country historically. The second leg up, which is just to the right of that second circle, is what we've seen this year. So last year it was pretty much about the economics and funding. This year it's been about the election and the politics. So over the course of this year, as we saw at the beginning of the year, probably around March, opinion polls putting Christina Kirchner ahead in the polls, maybe even winning according to some. That spooked markets because they were worried. Everybody remembers what happened under her reign and previously. So we saw this further widening in yields. And of course, that's made it even harder for Macri to try and rebalance the economy and stick to the programme. I provocatively put a description at the end there called CFK Premium. I think if Christina wasn't on the scene, if she hadn't decided to run, if she was not in the mix, we probably wouldn't even be here today, because Argentina would, I think, the possibility of outcomes would be narrower than I think we are facing at the moment. So I think it's because of her presence that the market is worried about what it would mean, and therefore this has been built into country spreads, this premium effect. If Macri wins, spreads would come down because she's not there. They wouldn't come down to the emerging market base because there are still economic issues, as we've heard, and I will say, that he has to deal with. But it would be a lot easier without that political context. This is a similar way to say the same thing. This is looking at the peso over the last 5 years or so since Macri became in office. So instantly he devalued the currency, alleviating some of the overvalued exchange rate pressure that had been caused under Kirchnerism. And then it flatlined a little bit, this gradualism, not really doing too much to stress the system. And then, of course, at the spring of last year, we saw huge pressure on the currency, both from foreigners looking to exit in an environment of risk aversion globally, but also, I think, domestic substitution from pesos into hard currency. So to give you an example of that pressure, the central bank spent about $6 billion over the course of late April defending the exchange rate, obviously to no avail. That was about 10% of its prevailing reserves at the time. You can't keep doing that forever, so either you have to adjust, or in this case you adjust, but also you call in the IMF. That's what they did, and they got this program as a result. Of that program, it's a large program, as I say, $56 billion. I think something like 70% of it has been dispersed already after the fourth review that was just concluded. It's due to end in 2021. So it was essentially heavily front-loaded to try and give Macri a bit more of a war chest to aid the adjustment process, insulate it from external shocks, and ultimately, I suspect, to try and make sure that he was re-elected. In terms of where we are now, so the peso is at around 43. According to the central bank's latest survey of private expectations locally, year-end exchange rate is seen as a 50, and I think at the end of next year it's about 60. I think that is obviously predicated on some sort of smooth transition through the election process, which we can come on to. Needless to say, if you have a sort of external or financial market shock of that size, it's going to have its impact on the economy. It's going to have a real economic impact. So firstly, we've seen inflation accelerate because of the pass-through of the FX through to the inflation rate, which is very quick and prevalent in Argentina, given its history. So you see inflation going up from 20% at the beginning of last year now to a print of about 55. Yes, in the last few months, you can see the bar chart at the bottom. So since March, the month-on-month prints have been coming down, which might give you some consolation that inflation dynamics may have turned. The exchange rate has been relatively stable in the last few weeks, and some prices are regulated. So we might see inflation dynamics improve through to the end of the year. The IMF are forecasting 40% inflation. It's still a high figure, mind. 40% inflation by the end of this year. They've increased that expectation from 30% just a few months ago. So coming down, but still high, and higher than they thought it was previously. But to get that, inflation needs to print at about 2.3% month on month for the second half of this year. And bearing in mind where you see that lower bar chart, we've had inflation prints at 4% month on month. The last 3 months have been about 3%. So it's going to require, even to deliver that IMF target, lower inflation than we've seen in recent months. Does this matter? It matters because there's an election around the corner. If there isn't progress, I think, on delivering lower inflation, it may already be too late. But if there isn't progress, then that counts, I think, against Macri and into the opposition's favour. As I say, with that kind of financial market disturbance over the last 18 months or so, you also have an impact on the real economy. So with the inflation increasing and the need to turn to the IMF, you've had to tighten policies. Unemployment has risen. Growth has slowed, uncertainty has increased, so we've had a recession, a deep recession last year that continues into this year. 5 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth have been seen. The consensus for this year is minus 1.3%. That's not a great backdrop to fight an election. And things might get better in the second half. We've seen some signs of stabilisation. Probably too early to put your hat on it, but there is an optimism that maybe things have bottomed and that they've turned the corner. But still, negative growth this year. So we might see that positive growth translate more into next year's performance, again predicated on a smooth election process. So the range of GDP forecasts for next year, for instance, is quite wide. The consensus is just over 2%, so positive, a recovery. The government is saying 3.5%. Don't know where they got that figure on. It's quite upbeat. And the IMF are more cautious. They're saying about 1% in the latest review of the programme, and they've shaved that down from 2% just a few months ago. So there's been a bit of downward pressure on growth projections from a backward-looking perspective, but there might be optimism that that turns round. Again, does that recovery in the GDP figures come too late for Macri come August primaries and October's election? As well as some sort of cyclical rebound and based on some sort of tightening and maybe a little bit more confidence that the situation has hit the bottom, we're seeing potential growth drivers from agriculture because of good crops in soy, maize and corn, and also, as Andrew said, in terms of energy and shale. I think Argentina exported its first oil from Vaca Muerta last month, both oil and LNG, and that should increase going into next year, providing the politics is supportive. Talked a little bit about the impact of the financial markets, the external destabilising impact that had, domestic policy inadequacies, and the real economic impacts. What has the government done about it? This chart shows the twin deficit in Argentina, which is an economic concept. It's the sum of the current account and the fiscal balance. When they're both in deficits, this gives you a twin deficit. As a rough rule of thumb, I would say if you sum these together and get a number above 10% of GDP, it's not the end of the world, but it's worth watching. And you can see on that basis that in 2017, so the far left, before the crisis took hold, Argentina was carrying a twin deficit of nearly 12% of GDP, comprising roughly equally a large current account deficit, 5%, and a large fiscal deficit, 7%. And it's essentially that twin deficit that, when global rates turned in the spring of 2018, caused markets to get a little bit anxious about how they're going to fund it. A 5% deficit when rates are going up and you're heavily reliant on external markets, can you continue to finance that? So that's why markets got spooked. Where we are now, 2018, I think, no, 2019, you've seen a projected improvement in that twin deficit, halving, more than halving, going down to, about less than 5 percentage points. So that's a huge, the scale of the adjustment in Argentina has been quite impressive. That is a combination of policy-led improvements, i.e. tighter fiscal policy, tighter monetary policy, the exchange rate cheapening up. It's obviously also because demand has collapsed, so imports have collapsed, so that helps the current account, but it's a combination of both, which were necessary for sure. Otherwise you probably wouldn't have got an IMF programme. They've also been politically costly, and that's why Cristina and her ticket are doing so well in the polls. The GDP, the dollar GDP in per capita terms from 2017 to projected 2019 is down about 27%. So when you have inflation at 50, your recession, and your dollar per capita incomes have fallen by nearly a quarter, you can see why there's opening ground for the opposition. I'm not going to dwell on this particular chart because it's quite busy and quite complicated, but in terms of the next couple of slides, whoever wins the election, whether it is the Macri ticket or the Fernandez's ticket, they will still have to deal with the economy. The financing needs in Argentina are large. Actually, I've got this slide, a typo in the title. It's not external financing needs, it's federal government financing needs, but it's arguably still the same sort of story. Financing needs are very large. This year, financing needs are of the order $90 billion, which I think is probably getting on for 20% of GDP. Now, obviously, a lot of that has been funded through various orthodox means, but there was a funding gap, the top blue line, which the IMF had to fill. Going into next year, the financing needs are lower, but they're still of the order, I think, $80 billion. They're still large. So you still have to finance that. So you still have to try and maintain policy discipline to access domestic markets and hopefully international markets on favourable terms. Whoever is in office will have to make sure that they can borrow money at sensible rates and finance this gap. The thing here is you don't have a lot of room for manoeuvre to change this in the very near term. Obviously, if you blow out the budget, which is a concern about Christina Kirchner, then that automatically means you've got a lot more to finance. But if you assume some sort of policy discipline, then the main drivers of these financing needs are your interest costs and your amortization. Your interest costs are large because people have increased perceptions of country risk, and central bank rates have gone up to fight inflation, so your local borrowing costs are high. If you are able to present a credible economic programme, then maybe your interest costs will come down, and that will feed through into lower financing needs going forward. Similarly, your amortization profile, these are debts that you've taken on in the past that are now falling due. You have to pay them, arguably. You could avoid them, but that's another story. You arguably have to pay them. And there's not much you can do to change that profile. If you are also raising a lot of money at short term, then that's going to fall due. Like if you raise it for 3 months, say, then that's going to fall due pretty quickly. So it's just going to mount. Your financing needs are just going to keep mounting up and mounting up. And actually, Argentina's been doing that a little bit in the last few months. If the situation normalises and you have more of a credible policy with fiscal discipline, then you can start to borrow longer from different sources at cheaper rates, and the amortization profile gets pushed back a little bit and makes it easier in the near term. If you don't take any of those options and you don't follow orthodox policy, then the obvious implication is that at some point you would struggle meeting your financing requirements, and ultimately you might then be forced to restructure. The other challenge, it's kind of related to the previous slide, is the public debt burden, which has also risen over the last year or so. So pre-Macri, post-Macri, immediately post-Macri, public debt to GDP was of the order of 50 to 60%. That actually isn't that high in an emerging market or frontier market context. It's not that high in the European Union either. It was supported by reasonably positive debt dynamics, and actually the autarky that occurred under Christina Kirchner, isolated for many years from the financial markets because legacies of default, meant that Argentina was probably underleveraged anyway. So public debt about 50% of GDP with positive growth, inflation coming down, the pesos stable, the debt dynamics were broadly okay. As we've heard, Argentina did borrow a lot under Macri. I think it was about $43 billion in bonds over the course of 2016 to 2018, basically to try and leverage up and try and invest and meet the promises and improve the economy. But of course in 2018, the combination of a recession and the collapse in the peso has meant that the public debt burden has spiked to near 80% or over 80%. It's a bit the same as Brazil, but Brazil is obviously in a different risk spectrum. So the challenge, as well as meeting those financing needs for the next president, will be to try and return the debt dynamics to a sustainable path, which again requires credible policy and elements of fiscal, monetary and peso stability. This is my last slide, the fun slide. So the economic situation is difficult. The hope for the government, the incumbent, will be that you see some improvements, however marginal, over the next few weeks and months until the election, so that you have a better chance of getting re-elected. I think that is a reasonable scenario, but it's obviously not without risk. If Macri were to be re-elected, then I would say you would have a return to some sort of continuity, whatever normal is in Argentina these days. But as I say, you would remove that political risk premium from Christina Kirchner. Things wouldn't return to how they were sort of 2016, 2017, but you would see a trajectory of maybe things beginning to return to normal because you don't have that domestic disruptive factor. And then it would make IMF compliance easier. That's the first scenario. The second scenario, of course, is that it's all too late and Christina, her ticket, win. two sub-scenarios I see in that. Firstly, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that with Alberto Fernandez and Massa and people like that in the team, that they actually embrace a more orthodox agenda than we saw under Christina's legacy. We see a gradual recovery, not maybe as quick as it is under Macri, because there would be an element of distrust from the markets until they are proven wrong, until they see some implementation and evidence of a credible programme. So you could see a slower adjustment, a slower improvement, but nonetheless a more mainstream outcome, let's say. Of course, the fear is that you don't get that Christina will hold the reins, she will revert to type, the markets will be punishing her, the peso will come under further pressure, they want to renegotiate the IMF programme, but what to, we don't know, what does that mean? Financing needs are still very large. Ultimately, they might find they have very limited room for manoeuvre and have to default, either willingly or not. Willingly because ideologically they are against the Macri debt, or just because of ability to pay they run out of policy options. I'm leaning more to the former than the latter scenario. I kind of agree with your scenario weights, about 55-45, maybe 60-40. But the problem from a market perspective is, okay, the weights are these, but what do you get in return? In the first one, your spreads might return to the emerging market average, maybe 500 basis points, maybe lower, from currently 800. That's a nice little return. In the alternative scenario with the Cristina Fernandez ticket winning, default, your bonds are going to fall to something like 50. So the probabilities of the outcomes may be broadly similar, but from a bond investor's perspective, your returns are going to be quite different. So it's almost this asymmetric risk, which is why we're cautious on Argentina at the moment, needless to say. That's it.